I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop on a Tuesday evening scrolling through Facebook while waiting for my takeout order when I saw it. My Aunt Carol had posted a video from my parents' 35th wedding anniversary dinner the weekend before. The caption read something cheerful about family celebrations, but as I watched the shaky phone footage of relatives chatting around their dining room table, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. In the background, clear as day, my mother's voice carried over the ambient noise as she spoke to my Uncle Robert and his wife. "Our ungrateful son Stanley just lives off us like a freeloader," she said with obvious irritation. My father's deeper voice chimed in immediately. "We give him everything and get nothing back in return." I stared at my phone screen in complete disbelief, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For 3 years, I had been secretly paying their mortgage, car payments, medical bills, and living expenses ever since my father's heart attack nearly destroyed their finances. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife ever could. Walking back to my downtown apartment that night, I felt like I was moving through a fog of confusion and hurt. The takeout bag in my hand grew cold as I climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, my mind reeling from what I had just heard. Once inside, I tossed the untouched food onto my kitchen counter and grabbed my laptop from the coffee table. With trembling fingers, I opened my banking app and began scrolling through 3 years of transaction history. Every month, like clockwork, the payments were there in black and white. $1,800 for their mortgage payment, $400 for their car loan, $600 for my mother's diabetes medication and insulin supplies, $300 for their utility bills, the grocery deliveries I arranged every 2 weeks, the emergency furnace repair last winter that cost me $2,000, the new roof they needed after the storm that set me back $8,000. I pulled out a calculator and started adding everything up. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 3 years, I had quietly transferred nearly $120,000 to support their comfortable lifestyle. Not once had I asked for recognition or gratitude. Not once had I mentioned the sacrifices I was making. I clicked back to Facebook and watched the video again, this time with the volume turned all the way up. My mother's voice was crystal clear as she complained to my uncle about my supposed freeloading ways. "Stanley just can't seem to get his life together." She continued in the background of Aunt Carol's cheerful anniversary footage. "We keep hoping he'll grow up and move out, but he just keeps depending on us for everything." The irony was so thick it made me feel sick to my stomach. I remembered the conversation I had with them just 6 months after graduating from college with my computer science degree. I had received job offers from 3 major tech companies in Silicon Valley with starting salaries that would have set me up for life. Instead, I chose to take a position with a smaller software development firm here in our little Ohio town of Millfield population 12,000. The pay was decent, but nothing compared to what I could have earned in California. Why did I make that choice? Because my parents needed me close by. My father, William, had suffered a massive heart attack at age 58 while working his construction job. The medical bills were overwhelming, and his disability payments barely covered their basic needs. My mother, Linda, worked part-time at the local grocery store, but her income was minimal. They were drowning in debt and facing the very real possibility of losing the house I grew up in. So I made a decision that changed the trajectory of my entire life. I stayed home, took the local job, and quietly began covering their expenses. I never wanted them to feel ashamed or dependent, so I disguised my help in various ways. I told them I got a great deal on paying their mortgage directly to build my credit history. I claimed their car payment was helping me establish a relationship with their bank. I said covering their medical expenses gave me better tax write-offs. They believed every explanation because they wanted to maintain their dignity. I understood that pride was important to them, especially in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. So I crafted this elaborate fiction that allowed them to accept my help without feeling like charity cases. But now sitting in my apartment listening to my mother call me a freeloader, I realized how completely I had miscalculated their reaction to my generosity. Somehow in their minds, my quiet support had transformed into dependence on their part. They had convinced themselves that they were carrying me rather than the other way around. I closed my laptop and walked to my bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street below. My neighbors were settling in for the evening porch lights, glowing warmly in the gathering darkness. Everything looked normal and peaceful, but inside my chest I felt like my entire world had just shifted on its axis. The worst part was remembering how I had turned down that job in California. Google had offered me a position on their cloud infrastructure team with a starting salary of $140,000, plus stock options and benefits that could have made me financially independent by age 35. Instead, I was here in Millfield making $68,000 a year and spending more than half my income keeping my parents afloat while they told relatives I was the one who couldn't manage my finances. I sat down on my bed and put my head in my hands, trying to process the enormity of what I had discovered. 3 years of sacrifice, 3 years of putting their needs before my own career prospects, 3 years of careful financial management to ensure they never had to worry about money again. And their response was to paint me as an irresponsible burden who was taking advantage of their generosity. The next morning, I called my younger sister Madison during my lunch break, hoping she might offer some perspective or comfort. Madison was 25, married to her college boyfriend Derek, and living about 2 hours away in Columbus where she worked as a nurse practitioner. We had always been close growing up, and I figured she would be as shocked as I was by what our parents were saying behind my back. Instead, her reaction caught me completely off guard. "Oh, Stanley," she said with a heavy sigh when I told her about the video. "I was hoping you would never find out about that." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean you were hoping I would never find out you knew about this?" Madison was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "They complain about you pretty regularly when I call them. They say you depend on them too much and that they wish you would become more independent. I always figured it was just normal parent stuff, you know? Like how parents always worry their kids aren't quite ready for the real world yet." I could barely believe what I was hearing. "Madison, I don't depend on them at all. I have my own apartment, my own job, my own life. I've been paying their bills for 3 years." "Wait, what do you mean you've been paying their bills?" So I explained everything: the mortgage payments, the medical expenses, the car loan, the utilities, all of it. Madison listened in stunned silence as I laid out the full scope of my financial support for our parents. When I finished, she was quiet again for several seconds. Then she said, "Stanley, that makes no sense. They told me just last month that they were worried about your spending habits and that you kept asking them for money to help with rent and groceries." The betrayal cut even deeper now. Not only were my parents lying to extended family about my supposed dependence on them, but they were also lying to my own sister. They had created this complete fiction where I was the irresponsible child who couldn't manage money while they were the long-suffering parents who were propping me up financially. "Madison," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "have they ever asked you not to mention these conversations to me?" Another pause. "Well, yes, actually. Mom always says something like, 'Don't tell Stanley we talked about this because we don't want to hurt his feelings or make him feel bad about himself.'" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They don't want to hurt my feelings, Madison. They've been calling me a freeloader while I pay for their entire lifestyle. They've been telling you I ask them for money when I've never asked them for a single penny. They've convinced you I'm financially irresponsible when I make more money than both of them combined." Madison was starting to sound upset. "Stanley, I had no idea. They made it sound like they were being supportive parents helping their adult son get established. I thought maybe you were going through a rough patch or something." "The only rough patch I've been going through is working extra hours and living in a tiny apartment so I can afford to keep them comfortable. Do you know what I could have done with the $120,000 I've given them over the past 3 years? I spent the rest of our conversation explaining the job opportunities I had turned down, the lifestyle I could have had, the investments I could have made if I hadn't been quietly supporting two people who were simultaneously bad-mouthing me to anyone who would listen. By the time I hung up, Madison was apologetic and angry on my behalf, but the damage was already done. That evening, I decided to do some more investigating. I created a fake Facebook profile and started looking through my parents' social media posts from the past few years. What I found made me feel even sicker. My father had been posting regularly about their well-deserved retirement and their comfortable lifestyle, pictures of the new fishing boat they bought last spring, which I had paid for, when they told me they needed money for emergency roof repairs, photos of expensive dinners out which they could afford because I was covering their basic living expenses. Vacation pictures from the lake house they rented for a week last summer, paid for with the money I thought was going toward my mother's medical bills. Every single post painted a picture of two hardworking people who had earned their comfortable golden years through careful planning and financial responsibility. The comments from their friends were full of admiration and congratulations on their successful retirement. Not one post mentioned having a son who was helping them maintain their lifestyle. But even worse than the omissions were the active lies. My mother had shared a post about budgeting tips with the comment, "Some people never learn to manage money like adults, but Derek and I have always lived within our means." She was giving financial advice to her friends while living off my income and calling me irresponsible behind my back. The most painful discovery came when I found a comment thread from several months ago. One of their church friends had asked for advice about dealing with an adult child who was struggling financially. My father's response was detailed and condescending. "Sometimes you have to practice tough love. We've learned that enabling irresponsible behavior just makes it worse. Our son Stanley has had to learn some hard lessons about money management, but we think it's important not to bail him out every time he makes poor choices." I stared at that comment for a full 5 minutes, reading it over and over again. My father was giving advice about not enabling irresponsible adult children, while I was literally enabling his irresponsible financial management. He was telling people not to bail out their kids, while I was bailing him and my mother out every single month. The hypocrisy was staggering, but what hurt even more was imagining how this affected other people's perception of me. How many people in our small town had heard these stories? How many family friends thought I was some kind of deadbeat who couldn't get his life together? How many opportunities had I missed because people believed my own parents' lies about my character and capabilities? Over the next few days, I found myself digging deeper into the web of deception my parents had created. It became an obsession, this need to understand just how far their lies had spread and how much damage they had done to my reputation and relationships. I started by looking through my mother's Instagram account, which I had never paid much attention to before. What I found there was a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation. She had been documenting their comfortable lifestyle in careful detail, but always with captions that subtly reinforced the narrative of their financial responsibility and my supposed shortcomings. A picture of their well-stocked pantry was captioned, "Grateful for a full refrigerator and the wisdom to budget carefully. Some lessons are harder to learn than others." A photo of my father's new fishing gear was paired with the words, "Bill worked so hard his whole life and deserves nice things. Success comes from discipline and planning ahead." But the most infuriating posts were the ones where she shared expensive grocery hauls, restaurant meals, and shopping trips while making comments about financial responsibility. "Picked up some organic vegetables and grass-fed beef today. It costs more, but we've learned that quality is worth it when you budget properly." Some people think money management is too complicated, but it's really just about priorities and self-control. Every single one of these posts was funded by my income, but she was using them to position herself as a financial role model while implying that others in her life, particularly younger people, lacked the wisdom to manage money correctly. The grocery posts were especially galling because I had been having those expensive organic foods delivered to their house twice a week for 2 years. My mother never actually shopped for groceries anymore, because I had arranged for everything to be delivered directly to their door. But she was photographing my purchases and presenting them as evidence of her own careful budgeting and smart financial choices. I screenshot dozens of these posts, building a file of evidence that clearly showed how my parents were using my financial support to maintain their lifestyle while publicly presenting themselves as models of fiscal responsibility. But the social media discoveries were nothing compared to what I learned when I started making some discreet phone calls to mutual acquaintances. I called my old high school friend Marcus, who had stayed in touch with several people from our graduating class. During our conversation, I casually asked if he had heard anything about how I was doing, just out of curiosity about what people might be saying. Marcus was hesitant at first, but eventually he admitted that there had been some talk. "I didn't want to bring it up because I figured it might be a sensitive topic," he said. "But some people have mentioned that you moved back in with your parents after college and that you've been having a hard time getting established. Your mom was talking to Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store a few months ago, and apparently she was pretty worried about your situation. Mrs. Patterson had been our neighbor for 15 years. She used to babysit Madison and me when we were kids. The idea that my mother was telling her I was struggling financially, while I was actually supporting the entire family, made me feel like I might be sick." "What exactly did my mom tell Mrs. Patterson?" I asked. Marcus sounded uncomfortable, but he continued. "She said you were having trouble with money management and that they were trying to help you learn some responsibility. She mentioned that you were still depending on them for a lot of support and that they were hoping you would figure things out soon." I thanked Marcus for his honesty and hung up feeling like the walls were closing in around me. Mrs. Patterson volunteered at the library where my mother worked part-time. How many other people had heard this story? How many neighbors and family friends thought I was some kind of failure who couldn't take care of himself? But the absolute worst discovery came 3 days later when I decided to reach out to my ex-girlfriend, Sarah. Sarah and I had dated for 8 months last year, and I had thought our relationship was heading in a serious direction. She was smart, funny, beautiful, and we seemed to have a real connection. Then suddenly she started pulling away. Our conversations became shorter, our dates less frequent, and eventually she told me she thought we should just be friends. At the time, I couldn't understand what had gone wrong. We hadn't had any major fights or disagreements. The chemistry was still there, at least from my perspective, but Sarah became increasingly distant and eventually stopped returning my calls altogether. Now, with everything I had learned about my parents' campaign of lies, I wondered if Sarah might have heard something that changed her opinion of me. I sent her a text message asking if we could meet for coffee to catch up. She agreed, though she seemed surprised to hear from me. We met at a small cafe downtown, and after some awkward small talk, I decided to be direct. "Sarah, I know this might sound strange, but did anyone in your family ever say anything to you about my financial situation while we were dating?" Her expression changed immediately, and I knew I had hit on something. "Stanley, why are you asking me that? I've recently learned that my parents have been telling people some things about me that aren't true. I'm wondering if that might have affected our relationship." Sarah looked down at her coffee cup, clearly uncomfortable. After a long pause, she said, "Your mother called my mom last fall." I felt my heart sink. "What did she say?" "She told my mom that she was worried about us getting serious because you weren't financially stable. She said you had been asking them for money regularly and that you hadn't learned how to budget properly. She mentioned that you were still living like a college student and that she didn't think you were ready for a serious relationship or the responsibilities that come with it." I stared at Sarah across the table, speechless. My own mother had sabotaged my relationship by telling lies about my financial irresponsibility to my girlfriend's family. "My mom felt like she had to tell me, Sarah continued, because she was concerned about my future. She said your mother seemed really worried and stressed about your situation, and that maybe I should think carefully about whether you were ready for a committed relationship. And that changed how you felt about me." Sarah nodded slowly. "It made me start paying attention to different things. Like how you always insisted on paying for our dates, which I thought might be you trying to impress me even though you couldn't afford it. Or how you didn't talk much about your long-term financial goals, which I interpreted as you not having any. I started worrying that you might not be as responsible as I thought you were. I explained everything to Sarah. The job offers I had turned down, the 3 years of supporting my parents, the $120,000 I had quietly transferred to maintain their lifestyle. I showed her some of the bank statements on my phone, the regular payments that proved I was actually the one providing financial stability for my family. By the time I finished talking, Sarah looked stunned. "Stanley, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Your mother made it sound like you were barely getting by, and that your parents were constantly having to help you out." "My parents have never given me a single penny," I said. "I've been supporting them completely for 3 years, and they've been telling everyone the exact opposite story." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "That's horrible. I can't imagine why they would do something like that." Neither could I, but the damage was done. Sarah and I were able to clear the air that day, but our relationship had been destroyed by lies that my mother had deliberately spread to her family. Even though we parted on good terms, we both knew too much time had passed, and too much hurt had been caused for us to go back to what we had before. Walking home from that coffee meeting, I realized that my parents' deception had cost me far more than money. It had cost me love, respect, opportunities, and relationships that I might never be able to repair. They hadn't just taken my financial support while calling me a freeloader. They had systematically destroyed my reputation in our community while living off my generosity. The breaking point came 2 weeks later at my cousin Jenny's wedding. Jenny was Aunt Carol's daughter, the same aunt who had posted the video that started this whole nightmare. The wedding was being held at a beautiful venue about 30 minutes outside of town, and practically the entire extended family was going to be there. I debated whether to attend at all given what I now knew about my parents' lies. But Jenny and I had always gotten along well, and I didn't want to let family drama ruin her special day. I decided to go, but to keep my interactions with my parents brief and polite. The reception was held in a large banquet hall with round tables scattered throughout the room. I found myself seated at a table with some of my younger cousins, which was fine by me. I wanted to stay away from the older relatives who might have heard my parents' version of my life story. About an hour into the reception, I went to the bar to get a drink. On my way back to my table, I walked past where my parents were sitting with my Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia, along with a few other relatives I recognized but didn't know well. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but as I passed behind their table, I heard my father's voice clearly over the music and chatter of the reception. He was telling a story, and my name caught my attention. "The problem with Stanley," my father was saying, "is that he just can't seem to get a handle on his finances. He's constantly asking us for help with rent money, grocery money, you name it. Linda and I are getting worried because we're not going to be around forever, and we don't know what he's going to do when he has to stand on his own 2 feet." I stopped walking and pretended to check my phone while I listened to the conversation. My Uncle Robert responded, "That's tough, Bill. It's hard to know when you're helping and when you're enabling, you know." "Exactly," my mother chimed in. "We keep hoping he'll figure it out, but every month it's something else. His car needs repairs, or his rent is due, and he's short, or he needs money for groceries. We've been trying to teach him some financial responsibility, but it's been an uphill battle. I felt like I was going to be sick right there in the middle of my cousin's wedding reception. Not only were my parents continuing to spread lies about me asking them for money, but they were doing it in front of relatives who cared about me and might try to help based on false information." But then my father said something that made my blood run cold. "We've been thinking about cutting him off completely," he told the table. "Maybe some tough love is what he needs. Let him figure out how to pay his own bills for once, and see if that motivates him to get serious about his life." My mother nodded in agreement. "We hate to do it, but we're not doing him any favors by bailing him out every month. Maybe if he has to struggle a little bit, he'll appreciate what we've been doing for him and learn to be more responsible." I stood there frozen, holding my drink, and staring at the back of my parents' heads while they discussed cutting off the financial support they had never actually provided, while simultaneously planning to ask me for even more money to fund their comfortable lifestyle. Because that was the other piece of this puzzle that I hadn't mentioned yet. 3 days before the wedding, my mother had called me to say that they were thinking about doing some major renovations to their house. They wanted to update their kitchen and master bathroom, and they were hoping I could help them with a loan of $20,000. They promised to pay me back over time, though we both knew they had no ability to repay that kind of money on their fixed income. So they were planning to ask me for $20,000 while telling relatives they were considering cutting me off to teach me financial responsibility. They wanted to take my money while publicly humiliating me as an irresponsible burden who couldn't manage his own affairs. I walked back to my table in a daze, barely able to process what I had just heard. But the worst was yet to come. About an hour later, my grandmother approached my table. Grandma Helen was my mother's mother, and she was one of my favorite people in the world. She was 83 years old, sharp as a tack, and had always been incredibly kind to me. She pulled up an empty chair next to me and spoke in a quiet voice so the other people at my table wouldn't overhear. "Stanley, honey, I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been hearing some things from your parents that have me worried about you." I felt my heart sink. Not Grandma Helen, too. "What kind of things, Grandma?" She reached over and patted my hand in that comforting way she had done when I was a little kid. "They've told me you've been having some financial difficulties, and I want you to know that I'm here to help if you need it. I know money can be tight when you're young and getting started, and there's no shame in accepting help from family." I stared at my grandmother, this sweet woman who had always believed the best about everyone, and realized that my parents had poisoned her perception of me too. She thought I was struggling and irresponsible, and she was offering to help based on complete lies. "Grandma, I'm doing fine financially," I said gently. "I have a good job, and I'm able to pay all my bills without any problem." She looked confused. "But your mother said you've been asking them for money regularly, and that they're concerned about your spending habits. She mentioned that you might benefit from taking some financial planning classes, and I looked into it. There's a program at the community college that I'd be happy to pay for." My own grandmother was offering to pay for me to take financial literacy classes because my parents had convinced her I was irresponsible with money. Meanwhile, I had been managing not only my own finances but also theirs for 3 years, turning their potential financial disaster into a comfortable retirement lifestyle. I spent a few more minutes gently reassuring my grandmother that I was doing well and didn't need any financial assistance. She seemed relieved but also confused by the disconnect between what my parents had told her and what I was saying. I could see her trying to reconcile the two different versions of reality. That conversation was the final straw. It was one thing for my parents to lie to extended relatives or family friends. It was even somewhat understandable that they had manipulated my relationship with Sarah, as hurtful as that was. But involving my grandmother, making her worry about my well-being based on complete fabrications, was unforgivable. I left the wedding reception early that night and drove home in complete silence, my mind racing with anger and hurt. By the time I got back to my apartment, I had made a decision that would change everything. I spent that entire night sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, a calculator, and 3 years' worth of bank statements spread out in front of me. By sunrise, I had made a complete accounting of every penny I had spent supporting my parents, and I had developed a plan. The first step was simple. I immediately stopped all financial support without warning or explanation. On Monday morning, I called my bank and canceled the automatic transfer that sent $1,800 to my parents' mortgage company every month. I canceled the automatic payment for their car loan. I stopped the monthly transfer that covered my mother's medical expenses and prescription costs. I canceled their utility payments, their insurance premiums, and the grocery delivery service I had been paying for. In the span of 15 minutes on the phone with my bank, I cut off every stream of financial support I had been providing for 3 years. The customer service representative asked if I was sure I wanted to cancel so many automatic payments at once. I told her I was absolutely certain. The second step was to change my phone number and block my parents on all social media platforms. I knew they would start calling as soon as their bills began bouncing, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. I needed time to prepare for what was coming next. I took a personal day from work and spent Monday afternoon drafting a detailed letter. Actually, I wrote several letters. One for my parents explaining exactly why I was cutting off all support. Individual letters for my sister, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and several family friends who I knew had been fed false information about my situation. Each letter included copies of bank statements showing the payments I had been making for 3 years. I documented every transfer, every payment, every instance of financial support I had provided while my parents were telling people I was a freeloader who depended on them. But I didn't send the letters immediately. I wanted to see how my parents would react when the money stopped flowing. I wanted to know if they would come clean about their situation or if they would double down on their lies. I didn't have to wait long to find out. By Wednesday, my parents' mortgage payment had bounced. Their bank called them to let them know that the automatic payment had been declined and that they needed to make arrangements immediately to avoid late fees. By Thursday, their car loan payment had bounced as well. The finance company sent them a notice warning that their vehicle could be repossessed if the payment wasn't received within 10 days. By Friday, the utility company had left a voicemail saying their electricity would be disconnected within 72 hours if payment wasn't received. I knew all of this because I had called each company and asked them to contact me if there were any issues with the accounts since I had been the one making the payments. I told them I was no longer responsible for the accounts, but that I wanted to be informed if there were problems so I could decide whether to resume payments or let the accounts default. My parents tried calling my old phone number dozens of times over those first few days, but of course they couldn't reach me. I imagine they thought there was some kind of mistake, some technical error that had caused all of their automatic payments to stop simultaneously. On Sunday, exactly 1 week after I had cut off all support, I received a friend request on Facebook from my sister Madison. She was trying to reach me because my parents had called her in a panic, asking if she knew how to contact me. I accepted Madison's friend request and sent her a message explaining that I had changed my phone number and that I was taking some time to think about my relationship with our parents. I told her I would be in touch soon, but that I needed some space for a while. Madison responded immediately saying that our parents were frantic with worry and that there seemed to be some kind of problem with their bills. She asked if I knew anything about what was happening. I told her I would explain everything in a few days and asked her to let our parents know that I was safe and healthy, but that I needed some time alone to work through some personal issues. By the end of the second week, my parents were facing a financial crisis, unlike anything they had experienced since my father's heart attack 3 years earlier. Their house payment was late. Their car was in danger of being repossessed, and their utilities were about to be shut off. But rather than coming clean about their dependence on my support, they doubled down on their lies. I learned this when Aunt Carol called my workplace. My administrative assistant transferred the call to my office, and I was so surprised to hear Carol's voice that I answered without thinking. "Stanley, thank goodness I reached you," she said. "Your parents are worried sick about you. They said you've been out of contact for 2 weeks and they're afraid something terrible has happened." "I'm fine, Aunt Carol. I just needed some time to myself." "Well, they're not fine," she said. "They're having some kind of financial emergency, and they said you usually help them with advice about these things. Something about their automatic bill payments getting messed up by the bank. They were hoping you could help them figure out what went wrong." Even in the middle of a crisis that was entirely caused by the loss of my financial support, my parents were still maintaining the fiction that I was the one who needed their help. They were telling Aunt Carol that they normally helped me with financial advice and that they wanted my input on their banking problems. "I'm sure they'll figure it out," I said calmly. "They're both smart people who have been managing money much longer than I have." Aunt Carol sounded confused by my response, but she said she would let my parents know that I was okay and that they should contact their bank directly if they were having problems with their account. After I hung up, I realized that this phone call represented a test. My parents were still in denial about the reality of their situation. They were still trying to maintain their public image as financially responsible adults who occasionally helped their struggling son rather than admitting that they had been completely dependent on my support. That's when I decided it was time to send the letters. On Friday evening, exactly 3 weeks after I had stopped all payments, I mailed detailed explanations to every member of my extended family. Each letter included bank statements, payment histories, and a complete timeline of my financial support over the previous 3 years. I explained how I'd turned down job opportunities to stay close to home and help my parents after my father's heart attack. I documented every lie they had told about my dependence on them, including specific quotes from social media posts and conversations with relatives. But most importantly, I explained why I was sharing this information. I wasn't looking for sympathy or trying to embarrass my parents out of spite. I was setting the record straight because their lies had damaged my relationships and reputation, and I wasn't willing to let that continue. I sent copies of everything to Madison, to my grandparents, to my aunts and uncles, and to several family friends who I knew had been given false information about my situation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The family group chat that my cousins had set up years earlier exploded with messages within hours of people receiving my letters. Madison called me immediately after reading hers, crying and apologizing for not standing up for me when our parents were bad-mouthing me during their phone calls. "Stanley, I am so sorry," she said through her tears. "I had no idea how much you were doing for them. And I had no idea they were lying about everything. I feel terrible for believing what they told me." My Uncle Robert called that same evening. "Stanley, I owe you a huge apology. I had no idea what was really going on. Your parents painted a very different picture of your situation, and I believed them. I'm ashamed that I didn't think to question their version of events." But the most heartbreaking response came from my grandmother. Grandma Helen called me on Saturday morning and I could hear that she had been crying. "Stanley, honey, I don't understand what's been happening. I read your letter and I looked at all those bank statements and I just don't understand why your parents would tell me you were having financial problems when you were actually taking care of them." I spent an hour on the phone with my grandmother, gently explaining the situation and reassuring her that she had done nothing wrong. She was devastated to learn that she had been manipulated into worrying about me unnecessarily. "I offered to pay for those financial planning classes because I thought you needed help," she said. "But you were the one who had everything under control. You were the one taking care of your family. I'm so proud of you, and I'm so sorry I doubted you." Over the next few days, I received phone calls and messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Everyone was shocked by the revelations in my letter, and most were angry at my parents for the deception they had maintained. Aunt Carol was particularly upset because she realized her Facebook video had been what exposed the lies. She called to apologize and to let me know that she had deleted the video and posted a public apology for spreading false information about me. My cousin Jake, who had apparently been telling people at family gatherings that I was a loser living in my parents' basement, sent me a long text message apologizing for repeating what he thought was true information. He admitted that he had never bothered to verify what he was saying, and he promised to set the record straight with anyone who had heard his comments. But the most satisfying vindication came when my parents were forced to face the consequences of their lies. Within a month of losing my financial support, they had no choice but to put their house on the market. They couldn't afford the mortgage payments, even with my father going back to work part-time at the local hardware store, and my mother picking up extra shifts at the grocery store. The house sold quickly, but after paying off the mortgage and settling their other debts, they were left with just enough money for a deposit on a small apartment across town. The comfortable retirement lifestyle I had funded for 3 years was over. My father, who was 61 and had been enjoying his early retirement, suddenly found himself working 40 hours a week for $12 an hour. My mother, who had been working part-time by choice, was now working full-time out of necessity. The fishing boat they had bought with money I sent for roof repairs had to be sold to pay for my mother's medical expenses. The expensive vacations and restaurant meals they had been enjoying came to an abrupt end. For the first time in 3 years, they were forced to live within their actual means rather than the artificial means my income had provided. But the most poetic justice came when their lies were publicly exposed to the people whose opinions they cared about most. Mrs. Patterson, our longtime neighbor, approached me at the grocery store one Saturday afternoon. "Stanley, I owe you an apology," she said. "Your mother told me you were having financial difficulties and that they were helping you out. I had no idea you were actually the one supporting them. I feel terrible for believing something that wasn't true." The revelation that my parents had been lying about our family's financial dynamics spread quickly through our small town. People who had admired them for their financial responsibility and their patience with their supposedly irresponsible son now understood that the reality was exactly the opposite. Their church friends who had praised them for their generosity toward their struggling adult child were shocked to learn that they had been taking credit for sacrifices they never made while disparaging the son who was actually making those sacrifices. The most significant moment of justice came when Sarah called me. "Stanley, I heard about what really happened with your parents," she said. "Madison told my sister the whole story, and I wanted to call and apologize again. I had no idea your mother was lying when she called my mom last year. We met for coffee again, and this time the conversation was completely different." Sarah was genuinely remorseful about how our relationship had ended, and she was angry at my parents for manipulating her family with false information. "I keep thinking about how different things might have been if I had known the truth," she said. "You were actually more financially stable than anyone our age, and I was worried you were irresponsible with money. It's so unfair what they did to both of us." We talked for hours that day, and by the end of our conversation, we decided to give our relationship another chance. The connection we had shared was still there, and now that the lies had been exposed, we could rebuild our trust on a foundation of truth. Sarah and I started dating again, slowly taking time to repair the damage that had been done by my parents' deception. But knowing that we had both been victims of their lies brought us closer together rather than driving us apart. Meanwhile, my parents found themselves increasingly isolated as the truth about their behavior spread through our community. People who had respected them for their financial wisdom and their patience with their adult children now saw them as manipulative and dishonest. The most painful consequence for them was the damage to their relationship with my grandmother. Grandma Helen was heartbroken to learn that her daughter had lied to her and manipulated her into worrying unnecessarily about her grandson's welfare. "I don't understand why Linda would do something like that," she told me during one of our phone calls. "I raised her to be honest and kind, and what she did to you was neither of those things." My grandmother, who had always been close to my mother, began keeping her distance. She still spoke to my parents, but the warmth and trust that had characterized their relationship for decades was gone. 6 months after I cut off all financial support, my parents finally reached out with a letter of their own. It arrived on a Tuesday evening, delivered by hand to my apartment building, and left with my downstairs neighbor. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten by my mother, and signed by both of my parents. It was the first direct communication I had received from them since I changed my phone number and blocked them on social media. The letter began with an acknowledgement of their mistakes and a complete admission of the lies they had told about me over the previous 3 years. They admitted that they had been wrong to accept my financial support while publicly calling me irresponsible. They acknowledged that they had damaged my reputation and my relationships through their deception. But more than just admitting their mistakes, they tried to explain why they had behaved the way they did. My mother wrote that they had felt ashamed about needing my help, and that lying about our financial arrangement had been their way of preserving their dignity in front of friends and family. "We were embarrassed that our son was supporting us instead of the other way around," she wrote. "We knew it was wrong, but we thought if we just told people the opposite of the truth, no one would know how much we were depending on you. We never meant for it to go as far as it did, and we never meant to hurt your relationships or your reputation." My father added a paragraph explaining that they had convinced themselves they were protecting my privacy by not telling people about my generosity. He claimed they thought I would be embarrassed if relatives knew how much money I was spending to support them. So they created a cover story that ended up spiraling out of control. The letter concluded with a genuine apology and a request for forgiveness. They acknowledged that they had betrayed my trust and damaged my relationships. And they promised that if I was willing to rebuild our relationship, they would never lie about me again. They also included a detailed plan for how they intended to make amends. They promised to contact every person they had lied to and set the record straight about our financial arrangement. They offered to write letters to Sarah's family explaining that they had provided false information about my character and financial stability. They even offered to make a public post on social media acknowledging their mistakes and apologizing for their deception. Reading that letter was one of the most emotionally complex experiences of my life. On one hand, I was relieved that they were finally taking responsibility for their behavior and acknowledging the harm they had caused. On the other hand, I was still deeply hurt by 3 years of betrayal and manipulation. I took 2 weeks to consider my response before writing back to them. In my letter, I explained that I appreciated their apology and their willingness to make amends, but that rebuilding trust would take time. I told them I was willing to start with small steps toward reconciliation, but that our relationship could never go back to what it was before. I proposed that we begin with monthly dinners at a neutral location where we could talk and work on rebuilding our communication. I made it clear that I would not be resuming financial support, but that I was open to helping with genuine emergencies if they were honest about their needs and their circumstances. Most importantly, I established firm boundaries about how they could discuss me with other people. I told them that if I learned they were lying about me again or spreading false information about my life, our reconciliation would end immediately and permanently. My parents accepted these conditions without argument. They were grateful for the opportunity to rebuild our relationship even on my terms. Our first dinner together took place on a Sunday evening at a family restaurant halfway between my apartment and their new place. It was awkward and emotional, but it was a start. Over the following months, we slowly began to repair our relationship. My parents followed through on their promise to contact everyone they had lied to and set the record straight. They wrote letters to Sarah's family apologizing for the false information they had provided. They made phone calls to relatives explaining that they had been wrong about my financial situation and that I had actually been supporting them rather than the other way around. The process was humbling for them, and I could see how difficult it was to admit their mistakes to so many people. But they did it without complaint, and their willingness to endure that embarrassment convinced me that their remorse was genuine. Madison played a crucial role in our family's healing process. She had been deeply affected by learning about our parents' lies, and she made it clear to them that she would not tolerate any further deception about family matters. She became a bridge between my parents and me, helping to facilitate honest communication and holding everyone accountable for their words and actions. My grandmother, who had initially been very hurt by the revelation of my parents' lies, gradually began to rebuild her relationship with my mother as well, but she made it clear that her trust had been damaged and that it would take time to fully repair their bond. The most beautiful part of this healing process was watching my parents learn to take genuine pride in their son's success rather than feeling threatened by it. As they adjusted to their new financial reality and began to understand the scope of what I had sacrificed to help them, they started to appreciate the generosity I had shown rather than resenting their dependence on it. My father, who was working at the hardware store and learning to live within his means again, began to speak with genuine admiration about my financial management skills and my career success. My mother, who was working full-time for the first time in years, started to understand the sacrifice I had made by staying in our small town instead of pursuing better opportunities elsewhere. Sarah and I continued to rebuild our relationship as well, and a year after we started dating again, I proposed to her. She said yes, and my parents' genuine happiness about our engagement was one of the clearest signs that our family had truly healed from the damage of their lies. At our wedding reception, my father gave a speech that brought tears to my eyes. He publicly acknowledged the sacrifices I had made for our family and thanked me for my generosity and patience during our difficult period of rebuilding trust. He told our guests that he was proud to have a son who had shown such character and integrity even when he was being treated unfairly. That speech meant more to me than any amount of money ever could, because it represented something I had never thought I would have again: parents who were proud of me and willing to acknowledge my contributions to our family. The experience of confronting my parents' lies and working through our family crisis taught me several important life lessons that I will carry with me forever. First, I learned that generosity should never come at the cost of your dignity or self-respect. Helping people you love is one of the most rewarding things you can do. But if that help is not appreciated or acknowledged, it can become harmful to everyone involved. Second, I learned that enabling dishonest behavior, even unintentionally, can cause more damage than refusing to help at all. By allowing my parents to maintain their lies while I supported them financially, I became complicit in a deception that hurt multiple people and damaged numerous relationships. Third, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices. My parents needed to face the reality of their financial situation in order to understand the value of what I had been providing and to develop genuine appreciation for my sacrifices. Finally, I learned that forgiveness and reconciliation are possible even after serious betrayal, but they require genuine remorse, concrete changes in behavior, and time to rebuild trust. Today, 3 years after I cut off financial support for my parents, our family is stronger than it has ever been. My parents live modestly but comfortably within their means, taking pride in their work and their financial independence. Sarah and I have been married for 2 years and are expecting our first child. My relationship with my extended family has been strengthened by the honesty that emerged from our crisis. Most importantly, I have learned to value myself and my contributions in a way that I never did before. I no longer feel the need to hide my generosity or downplay my success in order to protect other people's pride. I have learned that true family relationships are built on mutual respect, honesty, and appreciation for each other's contributions. If you have ever found yourself in a situation where your generosity is being taken for granted, or where people are misrepresenting your character to others, I hope my story gives you the courage to stand up for yourself and demand the respect you deserve. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who were taking advantage of your kindness? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please like this video if it resonated with you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming family challenges and building healthier relationships. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of standing up for yourself while still maintaining love and forgiveness for the people who matter most. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the strength to create the respectful, honest relationships you deserve in your own life.